Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Monday evening, doing a show here from inside my house since we're remodeling R&T, and it's not ready. It's far from ready, so I'll be doing some shows here until it is ready. But I'm pleased to mention that we have Dizon on here, returning contributor, who's going to be teaching us about biblical Hebrew. This is actually really exciting because there's generally not a whole lot of online classes when it comes to biblical Hebrew, at least that I've seen. And Lewis, you're an expert in quite a few languages, so you're the best person to do it. So thanks for coming on and doing this.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So it is one of the things that I did notice when in hanging around Catholic academic circles. It's like certain languages tend to be more well known than others. Like I find that most Catholics know at least some Latin, and a substantial minority knows some Greek, but almost nobody knows Hebrew. Like of the major classical languages, like the Semitic ones, like Hebrew and Aramaic, tend to be neglected somewhat. Like their full usefulness isn't really understood or appreciated. So I figured this would be a great way to fill in a niche because I have that skill set that very few people in Catholic circles really have. And hopefully, in the process of doing these courses, I can make it so that a little bit more of that knowledge is disseminated in Catholic circles.
Yeah, I definitely. I hope so as well. And by the way, I attached a syllabus there on Patreon, so the same link that brings you here, you'll see the syllabus there. And I'm also going to post this on the St. Maximus the Confessor page, and you'll see the syllabus there as well. But Lewis, if you want to go ahead and dive in, Introduction to Biblical Hebrew, Lecture 1, whenever you're ready.
Sure. So first of all, if you could activate the screen share for me. That way I can talk a little bit about what we're doing here. I tried to structure it as a proper university level course because that's the best way I know how to do these things. So our goal here is basically for you to know the language. And when I say know the language, I mean actually have an understanding of how it works, not just memorize a bunch of verb tables, which is unfortunately how a lot of old classes on classical languages used to do things. We try to do things a little bit more organically here, so we'll use some of the same methods that are used in living languages such as French or German or Spanish. And also, I'll try to make it a practical course, so there will be quite a bit of translation involved. So you're not just learning theory, you're actually gonna be able to do some translations firsthand as you become able to. Some of the things that I'm hoping to accomplish here is give you knowledge of some of the most important Hebrew words, the ones that most frequently come up in the Bible. And you will hopefully develop a vocabulary of at least 700 words, ideally more, but 700 is a good foundation. And you should be able to know the different noun endings as well as the strong verb paradigms. So those who know various classical languages such as Latin or Greek will know that verbs tend to be their endings tend to change depending on whether it's singular or plural or what tense it is. Hebrew is a little bit more complicated because it also factors in gender, but I'll talk about that later on. So you also will know how to read Hebrew out loud, and you will learn how to translate some of the more easy passages in the Hebrew Bibles. For example, the book of Genesis is fairly simple Hebrew that most first-year students will be able to tackle, and perhaps also the books of Ruth and Jonah. And you should also be able to sight translate to a limited extent. This won't be a major focus, but hopefully when you learn this, you'll be able to look at texts that come up, and you'll be able to know what exactly you're looking at. Now, I'm a big fan of Memrise, which is a language learning app, and you can download this on your phone, or you can also use this on your computer. You can go to memrise.com and access any course there. They have thousands of courses on all sorts of languages, but there are some that are especially important for this course. So in the syllabus, you should have links to which ones they are. So there are 3 essential Memrise courses. So there's the Alphabet. This will teach you the letters, the consonants, and it teaches you both block letters as well as Cursive Hebrew, which I'll talk about a little bit later. You only really need to learn the block letters, although Cursive Hebrew is actually quite a useful skill to learn because it helps you write out Hebrew more quickly. And then you have vocabulary. There's a Memrise course that covers the top 1,000, and you'll try to learn at least the top 700 there. And then you have one for like conjugations of the regular verb. This is for memorizing different forms that the verb takes. And there's some optional ones here as well. Don't worry about those. This is for more advanced students. One thing I should note, for those who use the app Duolingo, they also have a Hebrew course, but it is for modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew uses the same alphabet as Biblical Hebrew, but the grammar is quite different. It's useful for internalizing how to read and write in Hebrew characters, and also you'll learn some of the vocab as well, because there is significant overlap in vocabulary between them. Now, for this course, I am going to use certain textbooks for teaching. If you're going to follow along with this course, I do highly recommend that you get these. And if any of you use Logos or Verbum, they will give you a better deal on these textbooks if you get their bundle, which I link to in the syllabus. Because the textbook, as well as the accompanying workbook, are both published by Lexham Press, which is a subsidiary of the company that produces Logos or Verbum. They really designed these materials to be used as part of their software, but you can still get the physical textbook. I will be using the online version, or like the Logos version. So later on, I'll be switching over to Verbum and showing you the textbook. If you are strapped for cash and can't afford even like the deal that Verbum is providing, there is a free grammar. It is the one that is written by Robert Homestead, who was my Hebrew professor at the University of Toronto, and an old version of his grammar is floating around on the internet. You can use that for free. The one caveat I should add there is that Homestead has a fairly it's a fairly rudimentary grammar. Like, he leaves a lot of stuff out because he focuses on like teaching things verbally. So you won't get as much out of Homestead's textbook as you would from the Lexham textbook. So I would still recommend, if you are able to get the Lexham Press textbooks. Apart from those two, the third book that I think is absolutely essential if you're gonna be doing this course is to have a lexicon. And the standard lexicon that is used in almost all Hebrew studies is Brown Driver Briggs. Fortunately, because it is an old book, it is available in the public domain. So I've attached a link to a free online copy of the book. You can download it there. And I'll have a whole bunch of recommended texts. You don't need to have these, but if you are serious about learning the languages, I recommend you take a look at the resources that I've listed here. Some of them are available for free online. I've attached links to where you can get them for free, so you can take advantage of those as well. And notice that, by the way, that while you will be dealing with Hebrew You don't have to get a physical copy of the Hebrew Bible because it's 2021. You can access the Hebrew text online in most Bible websites. If you go to Bible Gateway, for example, they do have the Hebrew Bible there. So I don't expect you to buy a physical Hebrew Bible. You can if you want to, but if you can't afford it at the moment, you can just use the online version. Now, for further reading, I've also attached a link to 5 articles from the Encyclopedia Judaica. And this is where it gets really technical. So this is totally optional. There are articles on the Hebrew language, the Hebrew alphabet, grammar, pronunciation, as well as manuscripts. Like if you are somebody who wants to become like a real biblical scholar down the road and you want to have an in-depth knowledge of the Hebrew language, I highly recommend downloading those 5 articles that I've linked to and read through them. So that is basically it. Oh, I should mention one more thing. Apart from the 3 required texts, I will occasionally be making use of one other grammar, which is this one. So Joan and Muraoka, Grammar of Biblical Hebrew. Unlike the Lexham Press textbook, this one is what you call a reference grammar. So there's a bunch of extra information on the grammar that isn't necessary for the course, but is still helpful to know for exegesis. And occasionally I will be mentioning certain grammatical points that are mentioned in Muraoka's textbook, but are not in the Lexham Press textbook. Well, with that out of the way, one last thing is the lesson plan. So the syllabus will tell you what I plan to cover in each session. So this is more of a guideline than a hard and fast rule. We may go faster or slower depending on the pace at which we go, but my goal is to, as much as possible, follow this schedule. So as you can see, I've spread out over 27 sessions, which will cover all of the textbook and about 2/3 of the workbook. The remaining 1/3 is more intermediate level, so I would be saving that for like a future course, God willing. For now, this is what I will be covering. So that being said, the very first thing that we will be needing to cover with regards to the learning the Hebrew language is, of course, the alphabet. So if I can switch over to Verbum now. There we go. So this is Learning Biblical Hebrew, Reading for Comprehension, an Introductory Grammar, published by Lexham Press. And you are currently looking at the first chapter, which is on the Hebrew alphabet. So one of the things that one of the first things most people learn about Hebrew is that it is what you would call a consonantal alphabet. What that means is these letters in the alphabet are only really denote the consonants of the language. Now, a few of them are actually used for vowels as well. So the Aleph, the Vav, and the Yod are used as vowels, but we'll get to that later on. So the Hebrew alphabet is actually originally the Aramaic alphabet. So what happened was, in the very earliest stage of the Hebrew language, it was written in a script known as Paleo-Hebrew. So if you look down here, the bottom row here is Paleo-Hebrew. And some of the very earliest Hebrew inscriptions that we have found, this is the alphabet that was used. Sometime around, we're not entirely sure, but possibly during the Babylonian exile, the Jews began using the Aramaic alphabet, which is the square script that is currently associated with Hebrew. Over time, Aramaic stopped using that script, and then they produced what is now known as the Syriac script. So what was the old Aramaic script became used almost exclusively for Hebrew, The only real exception was Jews who continued to use it when they wrote in Aramaic, as well as people who used it for other languages such as Yiddish or Judeo-Arabic. But from thenceforth, it became known as the Hebrew alphabet. Um, one of the interesting things about each of the consonants that make up the Hebrew alphabet is that each one represents a certain animal, or sorry, not animal, like a certain figure that represent the sound it makes. So, for example, the letter Aleph, which is the very first um, letter in the alphabet, was originally an ox head. So Aleph uh, denoted the ox. So the symbol for it was sort of an ox head. And also, it made its way into the Greek alphabet. So if you know the standard letter alpha or the Latin letter A, it also comes from this. The word for bait, or the word for house, was bait, and that gave us the word bet, which is the name of the second letter, and so on and so forth. So here we have the letters and their names. So we have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pe, Tzadeh, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. So here's a few things that I want you to make note of. One is that some letters have two forms. So the letters Kaf, Mem, Nun, Pe, and Sade all have what is called a final form. And what that means is when this letter appears at the end of a word, it looks like this. Those of you who've learned Greek may already be familiar with this concept because the letter sigma in Greek has two forms. But sigma is the only letter in the Greek alphabet that does this. In Hebrew, you have 5 letters that do it. The other thing that we should note here is that at least one letter in the Hebrew alphabet comes in 2 forms. So sin and shin are technically the same consonant, but as you can see, they're differentiated by the fact that one has a dot on the upper right side and the other has a dot on the upper left side. This may cause some confusion at first. Eventually, you'll learn to memorize this difference. And for purposes of learning Hebrew, they are treated as 2 separate letters. If you want to be technical about it, we distinguish between a grapheme and a phoneme. So a grapheme is like the actual shape of the letter itself, whereas a phoneme is like the sound that a letter makes. So you can say that Hebrew has 22 graphemes but has 23 phonemes. That's getting on the more technical side. You don't have to worry about that. Some things that I want to make note of here is that you might notice that some letters look similar to each other. So the letter Dalet and the letter Resh, for example, look similar. So Dalet is basically the letter D, and Resh is the letter R. And actually, all of the letters, you can tell what sound they make because that's the first consonant in their name. So A, B, G, D, etc. Now back to Resh and Dalet. So as you can see, the main difference between the two is that Dalet has a little tittle sticking out on the upper right hand side, and if you're not careful, it is easy to mistake these two for each other. And in fact, in some older Hebrew manuscripts, they are mistaken for each other, and I'll show you an example of that shortly. Another example is He and Chet. As you can see, both of them have a fairly similar shape. The main difference is that He has this little opening here, whereas Chet does not. And these two can also be sometimes mistaken for the Tav, which looks like the Chet, but is different in that it has a little foot on the bottom left side. So one of the early things that you have to make note of when you're learning the alphabet for the first time is um, avoiding avoiding conflating some letters that look similar to each other. So I mentioned that sometimes they were mistaken for each other in early Hebrew, and funny enough, we do see examples of that in the Bible. So this is an aside. But if you go to Genesis chapter 10, verse 4, I'm switching to Bible view now. Um, it says here, and the sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. Okay. So you can see this is the word Dodanim in Hebrew. You can see that right here you have a letter Dalet. Interestingly, if you look at Septuagint, you will see that it actually begins with the letter Ro, and then in the English translation of the Septuagint, it says Rodanim. Okay, now why does it say Rodanim instead of Dodanim here? If you look back, as I mentioned, the Dalet and the Resh look similar to each other. So it was quite likely that what was originally a Resh was mistaken for a Dalet, got miscopied as a Dalet in the Masoretic text, and that is the form in which we have it to this day. How do we know that it was originally a Resh? Because if you go to First Chronicles chapter 1, verse 7, and the sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Rodanim. Okay, so now you can see the Masoretic text has the same word, but has a Resh instead of a Dalet. So from this, we can infer that what was originally a Resh, got miscopied as a Dalet. So there is actually a Hebrew alphabet song floating around on the internet, and it's called the Aleph-Bet song. And it is, I would be remiss if I did not expose all of you to it. So I am going to switch briefly to my browser so that you can see this. So this is the Aleph-Bet video. Okay, so if you want to look it up, this is the title. And this is the standard video that is used to teach the alphabet in most Hebrew courses. So look it up for yourselves and then try to give it a listen. So we'll play it right now. Okay. Here we go. So it's kind of catchy, might be a little cheesy to some of you, but it is one of the best ways to really internalize the Hebrew alphabet. It's like how if you're learning the English alphabet for the first time, you learn the ABC song. Well, Hebrew has its equivalent, and this is it. And just try to listen to it like maybe a half dozen times. Might sound like torture at first, but it'll help you to internalize the alphabet and recognize each letter. One thing I should briefly mention is if you're wondering how does one type in Hebrew, you do have the option of installing a Hebrew keyboard on your computer. Most computers nowadays allow you to do that, but if you're lazy like me and you don't want to do that, one of the alternatives is something called LexiLogos. So you should be able to see it here, lexilogos.com/keyboard/hebrew.htm, and then you can type out a letter, for example, A, and it will transform it into an Aleph. And the nice thing about this is that each Hebrew letter roughly corresponds to the English or Latin consonant that makes the same sound as it. So you shouldn't have too much trouble finding stuff this way. Now, going back to logos, so let me just switch once more. Here. So just this is what I already said. And this is basically the same thing that I just showed you, but in a more, in a more laid out form. Now, there are a couple of things that I should make note of that the Aleph-Bet song doesn't necessarily make note of. One is that the letter Vav, that is the sound it currently makes, but in ancient Hebrew, it was most likely pronounced as a W sound. So it would have been called a wow rather than a vav. And like this is made more plausible by the fact that for those of you who speak other Semitic languages like Aramaic or Arabic, it is still called a wow. Also, some of these letters originally had multiple pronunciations, or they had pronunciations that are different from their current one. So the chet makes the ch sound currently, but once upon a time, it also made the h sound, which Arabic speakers might be familiar with. It's sort of like halfway between a ch and a h. And then the letter ayin is an interesting case because it doesn't really have its own distinct sound. Like it can easily be mistaken for an aleph. In fact, in some manuscripts it is. But originally, it had a fricative sound. It would have sounded like an ah sound. And those of you who speak Arabic will know this because in Arabic, one of the hardest letters to pronounce is the letter ayin. More interestingly, the letter ayin at one point in its history also made the gh sound. And again, Arabic speakers will recognize that sound because it corresponds to the Arabic letter ghayin. And that actually leads us to an interesting phenomenon in transliteration of Hebrew place names. So you might be familiar with Sodom and Gomorrah. What you might not be familiar with is the fact that in Hebrew, it's actually Sodom and Amorah. So here it says Doma ve'Amorah. So instead of Gomorrah, you have Amorah, which somehow in Greek, the letter ayin becomes a gamma, and that gets transliterated as Gomorrah in Latin and every European language ever since. It is most likely the case that the letter ayin here originally make a r sound, so it would have been Ramora, and as soon as it lost that sound, it became Amora. But by then, the sound got retained in the Septuagint. Also, it's the same thing with the letter with the place name Gaza. So it's actually Aza in Hebrew, and it was probably Gaza in ancient Hebrew, and it's still called Gaza in Arabic. But in Greek, it became Gaza, and in every European language, it has become that way. But that's advanced stuff. You don't really need to know that. I just figured I'd throw that in because it's interesting trivia for y'all. Now, the next thing that we need to make note of are what are known as the Begad Kefat letters. So there are 6 letters, the Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pe, and Tav, that have 2 different forms. So there's a dotted form and an undotted form. The dot is called a Dagesh, okay? And you basically place it in the middle like this. And what it does is it changes the pronunciation of the letter. Originally, this was the case with all 3 of them. So without a dot, it makes a V sound. And with a dot, it makes a harder sound. So the letter Bet, without a Dagesh, makes a V sound. But if you add the Dagesh to it, it becomes a B sound. And then the letter Pe, without a Dagesh, makes a F sound. With one, it makes a P sound. And originally, all 6 did this. So V, R, Th, H, F, Th. Over time, however, some of those sounds were dropped. So 3 of them in particular, the Gimel, the Dalet, and the Tav, became hard sound only. Only 3 of them, the Bet, the Kaf, and the Pe, retained the two distinct sounds. So you really only have to worry about 3 of the Begad Kefat letters producing a different sound. So Bet or Vet, Kaf or Chaf, Pe or Fe, and you'll be able to tell that it makes which sound it makes through the Dagesh. If it's starting to sound intimidating to you, don't worry too much. The more you work on your Hebrew, the more natural it gets. Like the biggest hurdle is this very first session when you learn the alphabet and the vowels. But the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. So there's also the gutturals. So these are the letters Ayin, Chet, He, and Aleph. So Aleph and Ayin both make an sound. He makes a H sound. Chet makes a Ch sound. And that is something that you'll want to make note of here. And then, so here's a brief note on how to write the alphabet. You may have noticed that it looks a little fancy with all the squiggles here. However, when we're writing it out, we tend to simplify it. So here, you should find that there is a way of writing what we call simplified block script. So it's still the same basic forms, but some of the fancier stuff gets taken out so that there's fewer strokes that you need to know. So if you get the textbook, you should find this there. If you use the Homestead textbook, this will have it too. So try to learn how to write out the simplified square script. Now, there is also the option of learning Cursive Hebrew, and I don't think Homestead textbook has this, but the Lexham textbook does. Cursive Hebrew is a relatively recent invention, so it It is derived from a variation of the Hebrew script that developed in the Middle Ages, and it was standardized and simplified with the creation of modern Hebrew. So this is how Hebrew is written by hand nowadays. And if you encounter written modern Hebrew, it's almost always written this way. I don't encounter a whole lot of people who write biblical Hebrew this way, but it is helpful to know because sometimes writing out extended portions of Hebrew can be very time consuming, and cursive Hebrew facilitates the process by making you do it in fewer strokes so you can write faster. And you can see some of them look fairly similar to their block script counterparts. Some of them look substantially different, but you can sort of see traces of the block script still in there. For example, if you recall, the shin faced upwards here, it's been turned on its side. And some of these tend to vary a lot. For example, I've never seen tav written this way. Most cursive tavs I've seen still look like the block script version. But if you look at Google image search, you'll find that. I should mention that at the end of each chapter, there will be some stuff about exercises. So this is meant to go with the workbook. I do highly recommend that after you read a chapter of a textbook, you also do the corresponding chapter of it in the workbook, assuming you get them, because that gives you the practice that you need to really internalize the language. We won't be covering any of that for the first session, but from the second session onwards, we'll also be covering workbook assignments. Now, we'll go to chapter 2, which is on the vowels. So, as you've just been given a crash course in the Hebrew alphabet, and as I mentioned, it only covers really the consonants. So you're wondering, well, how do you know which vowels go with the consonants? Well, there are basically two ways. One is that you get really good at reading Hebrew until it basically comes to you naturally. So native speakers of most Semitic languages don't really need vowel markers to indicate vowels. So a native Arabic speaker can read Arabic without needing like vowels to tell you how it's pronounced. Same with Hebrew. Like an Israeli can read a consonantal Hebrew script just fine without any vowels. But for someone learning the language for the first time, that might seem off. So I'll give you an example. Okay, so here's the first couple verses of Genesis without any vowels. Okay, it says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim vet haaretz, ve'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu v'choshek al pnei tehom, ve'ruach Elohim rachefet al pnei hamayim. Now, the lack of any consonants did not prevent me from reading this fine, because I'm familiar enough with Hebrew that I could read this without the aid of vowel markers. For the first time reader, though, they're not gonna be able to do that, which is why vowel markers were invented. Now, vowel markers first came about in about the 8th century. They were added to the Hebrew text by the Masoretes, so that it would be easier to recite the Hebrew Bible liturgically in synagogue services. Because if you know anything about Jewish liturgy, you know that proper pronunciation of the Hebrew Bible is very important to them. So the Masoretes added this, and the Masoretic Text, as it is called today, is basically the Hebrew Bible with all of the consonants and the vowels added in. So if you see a Bible without an ancient manuscript of the Bible that doesn't have these, we usually refer to them as the Proto-Masoretic Text. It's essentially the same text, but without consonants. and actually, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're not exactly the Masoretic text, but they do present you with an unvoweled version of the Hebrew Bible. So there's a number of vowels that we'll learn shortly. One thing that you want to make note of is that the vowel markers are meant to be recited after the consonant that's placed under. So this is ba, okay? So you have the letter bet, which makes the b sound, and then you have the kamets underneath, which is the long a sound. So the b with an a underneath, it makes the ba. Now here's the same letter, the letter bet, but now it has a holem on top, which is the dot on the upper left side, and that makes the o sound. So this is bo. Okay. Now we'll skip a bunch of these. So in the textbook, we will see a list of all of the vowels, or the technical term for this in Hebrew is called nikudim, nikudot, and so an individual one is called a nikud, and they're classified as A class, I class, or U class. That will tell you roughly what sound each one makes. So there's short vowels and there's also long vowels. So the very first one you should know is the patah, and that is like a little horizontal line placed underneath the letter and makes the ah sound. And then closely related to that is the kamets, which looks like a little letter T that is placed right below the letter, and that makes a slightly longer ah sound. When you're actually reciting this out loud, like the difference between the two tends to be blurry. So it is important to know that they're two distinct vowel markers, because there are some words that are identical except for this. But for pronunciation purposes, they more or less sound the same. Now, for the I class, you have segol, which makes the e sound, and then sere, which makes the a sound. So in modern Hebrew, the distinction between these two tend to be flattened, but it should be noted that they are distinct from each other. And then the hirek. The hirek is an interesting phenomenon because by itself, it is a short vowel. It makes the I sound. However, if the hirek comes before a yod, it is called the hirek yod and makes that E sound. So it's a longer sustained E. Now for U class, you have what's called the kamets katon, or the short kamets. So this is where it starts to get a little confusing. So the kamets is normally an A sound, but in a few places it makes an O sound. And you may be starting to think, what the heck? Don't be alarmed, because after you've learned a bit of Hebrew, you learn to tell them apart, and it will eventually become natural for you to tell which kamets is being used. So the kamets katon makes the O sound, and it is closely related to the holem, which makes a longer O sound. And holem can appear by itself, or it can appear above a vav. In both cases, the effect is the same. It makes a O sound. And then you have the kibbutz, which is a funny word, because if you know anything about Israel, you know that there are these communities called the kibbutzim. They're kind of like little socialist communes, and that's how I memorized the name of this. By the way, imagine like a little commune of 3 people standing diagonally, and it makes a short U sound. Now you have the shurek, which is a middle dot that appears on a vav, and that makes the longer U sound. Okay, so ooh. So you'll want to memorize these because this will help you to know how to pronounce Hebrew properly. Um, and if you get either the Homestead or the Lexham textbook, both of them will have this chart, so just go over it. The Memorize course that I linked to will teach you the consonants, but it doesn't really have the vowels in it, so you'll still need the textbook for the vowel part. So it's important to make note of these vowels and be able to identify them by name, length, sound, and vowel class. Um, like this is a little bit on the technical side, but it does help you to remember what sound each one makes exactly, as well as how to differentiate seemingly similar vowels. So the patach and the kamets, for example. Um, it's helpful to know for exegesis to just know that stuff. There is a there are a couple of other um, there are a couple of other things to note here. Um, you will want to know what a shiva is, so or a shawa. I call it a shiva because that's what it's called in modern Hebrew. But the it's basically the sign that is used to indicate the absence of a vowel. So so it says right here is this, um, the Hebrew vowel system requires you to note whether a certain consonant is vowelless. So if you are vocalizing Hebrew, every consonant has markers over or beneath it, even if it doesn't have vowels. And the shva actually comes in two forms. So the simple shva, which is basically the shva all by itself, and then the composite shva, which is the shva with another nikud attached to it. So you have a shva with the kamets, or a shva with a tsere, no, sego. Sometimes even I mix those two up. And then the shva with the patach. And it will be vocalized according to the other nikud. So you'll make this makes the a sound, this makes the s sound, this makes the a sound. Um, and of course, as it notes here, regardless of its appearance, a shiva is a shiva is a shiva. It's always used to represent the absence of a vowel. Um, there are some rules for knowing whether a shiva is silent or vocal. Because when it's vocal, then the shiva basically makes a sound, okay? And in transliteration, we usually use a tiny little e on it to represent it. Sometimes people will use like an apostrophe to represent it. So malachim. So malachim. So you can see the mem here. It's m because the shva underneath makes a little bit of a sound. Of course, if you're saying it really quickly, it just becomes mlachim, but it sounds slightly funny that way. So here, it is silent. If it's under the final consonant of a word, melech. Okay, so melech is the word for king. Actually, melachim is its plural form, and because the shva occurs at the end here, it doesn't make any sound at all. So melech. It might as well not be there, but Hebrew grammar demands that you put one underneath. So there it is. In the middle of a word, after a long vowel, it is vocal. After a short vowel, it is silent. So this is why it's important to differentiate a patach from a kamets, because that is one of the ways you can tell how it should be pronounced. So yelchu. Okay, so because the tsere before it is a long vowel, um, that affects this. So yelchu. So sorry, it's not yelchu. It's yelechu, as in here. And then by contrast, mamlacha. So the patach is a short vowel. So according to this rule, the shava next to it is silent. The tsere it's vocalized, the patach it's silent. So double shva at the front of a word is possible. Sorry, impossible. So the first two consonants cannot both have a shava. However, if it's the last two consonants of a word, they could both have it. In which case, it's pronounced this way, katalt. So notice that in this case, both are silent. Katalt. Um, and then this double shva in the middle of the word, the first one is silent, the second one is vocal. So here it's mamlechot. So mamlechot. So the first one is silent, as you see, mam, and then le chot. And of course, there's a handy little rule that you can make note of here. After long vowels, the shava is loud, so it's vocal. And then after short vowels, the shava is sh, or silent. This is just the same rules in more detail. And of course, there are some additional notes. One last marker that you need to note for this chapter is what is called the Dagesh. Okay, so sometimes a letter will have a Dagesh in the middle like this. So that's the dot in the middle. We already saw how sometimes certain letters will have something there to indicate whether it's a hard sound or a soft sound. So that's one of its uses. The other use that the Dagesh has is what is called the Dagesh Forte, so the strong Dagesh. And what this means is that the letter is essentially being doubled, right? Because in Hebrew, you try not to put two letters in a row. So, chite, okay, so chite. So the t sound with the tet is doubled, as you can see here. But you can't write Hebrew this way. Okay, you can't write two tets in a row. So what they do is they write one tet and then they put a dagesh in the middle to indicate that the letter is doubled. So chite. Okay. So another term for this is called the doubling dot. Not all letters can take this. So remember I mentioned the gutturals. So these letters, they do not take Dagesh Forte. So they are generally not dotted. And so you cannot, because so these generally do not get doubled because, as it says here, it's difficult to double a consonant that's pronounced in the back of the throat. And also, there are certain letters that can lose the dagesh under special conditions. This is, you don't have to worry too much about this at the moment because it's not a high priority grammatical rule. But just so you know, these letters, which you can remember by the mnemonic Skinnem Levi, is basically letters that can sometimes have a Dagesh Forte and other times they lose it. And finally, you have the Mapik, which is sort of like a Dagesh, but it's placed at the hey at the end of a word to indicate that it makes an emphatic h sound. And this is important because sometimes The only way to tell certain words apart is with the presence of the mapik. So one of the examples that's mentioned here is the word for queen, malka, as opposed to her king, malka. So with the mapik, it's more emphasized a little bit. But otherwise, to the untrained ear, they sound the same. And the only way you can tell them apart is with that dot. Now, you're maybe wondering at this point, well, at one point, these words do not have dots. So how did the Masoretes or, the Hebrews know the difference? Well, um, truthfully, they didn't. And sometimes you will see um, rabbis differing with each other over which one is it? Is it queen or is it her king? Over time, the Masoretes decided it was going to be one way, and they made their way official by placing the definitive dottage on these words. Some manuscripts do have differences in some of these, and that might affect the way certain passages are read, but those types of passages are few and far between. So there is a bunch of other things to make note of here. So these are not, again, these are not as important to make note of. I will encourage you guys to read it on your own time. We're already passing 1 hour, and yeah. So basically, this is all of the important stuff. So I would recommend that you guys get the textbook and read through the first 2 chapters. For the early parts, the Homestead and the Lexham textbooks both will contain the same material. From here on out, I'm just going to be referring to the Lexham textbook. Over time, you'll find the difference. The Lexham textbook does teach more stuff, and you won't be getting it from Homestead. And occasionally, I'll be supplementing that with more Oka, because there's some really useful stuff here that you won't get from the Lexham textbook, and I'll make note of that as necessary. For that, for those who are invested in this course, get these and also do the corresponding exercises. So do the first couple of chapters, and then next session, Lord willing, we will review this and we will get around to doing the syllables as well as how to read Hebrew. Also, I meant to get you guys to read the Introduction to the Hebrew Bible in the Appendix. I will try to send that as its own separate document, and you guys can read that in your own time. And that is basically it for this portion of learning Hebrew. Hopefully you guys found that helpful. Oh, I didn't realize that the song audio is too low. So hopefully one thing I can do is I'll just send a link to that as well, and then you guys can listen to it in your own time.
Yeah, I couldn't hear it, but from the little that I could hear, it wasn't the one that I learned in Hebrew school. So it didn't remind me of the one I heard. I'll see if I can find mine too. And, yeah. But good stuff.
One version of the Hebrew alphabet, but thank you very much.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this. I really appreciate you doing this, Louis, and I'm sure everybody who's watching is extremely grateful as well. So, once again, thank you for coming on and doing this. I look forward to the next one.
Yeah. Hopefully, I think you guys do like the Patreon videos are like what, once a month or twice a month?
Yeah, I try to get at least one a month, but maybe 2.
Yeah.
But really, we're going to work around your schedule, whatever you can do.
Okay. I can do this maybe like twice a month. So
I think that'd be perfect.
I can do the next one like maybe a couple of weeks from now.
Awesome. Well, I'll put
Yeah.
a date there on Patreon, so y'all look forward to that. But yeah, in 2 weeks, that'd be perfect. I'll talk with you off the air about some dates.
All right. Awesome.
And everybody, thank y'all for watching. This first video we're going to make available to everybody, but of course, if you would like to watch the rest of them, check out patreon.com/reason and theology. Once again, thank you, Louis.
All right.
And thank you all for
You're
watching.
very welcome.
God bless. Take care.